Okay, this is Mr. Williams. Here's a flipped classroom on Book 3, specifically lines 1 through 417, that mostly consist of direct conversation between God and Son up in heaven. Some critical considerations. Obviously, book number 3, and the number 3 is often associated with Christianity, in particular God in the Trinity, and the idea that Jesus was dead for 3 days. On the third day, he rose again. We have the comparison and contrast of the scenes of volunteering with the sons and the Satans. And then, lastly, you know, Milton is making God a character. He has to in this narrative, but those last two bulleted questions, how does Milton's portrayal of God serve, say, his narrative purpose? Well, he needs to have a character say these things. But how does Milton's portrayal of God perhaps undermine his theological purpose? These are considerations we will face as we study Book 3. In Book 3, Milton directly attempts to justify the ways of God by having the character God directly address and extol the value of free will. However, because Milton is also committed to a portrayal of God as omniscient, he raises the question of, can predestination and free will coexist? I am not claiming that I will answer this question. It has existed for eons and centuries beyond that. Um, but here is a little cartoon suggesting there's an illusion of free choice, that free choice is what we experience. But as this cartoon suggests, what we experience is not reality. Um, and here's just another little image suggesting that, you know, there are forces that influence or even control what we experience as free will. Um, in one article that I have a link to at the end of this podcast, they're suggesting that there's electrical impulses that happen in our brains that predict our decision making process, but those electrical impulses can be measured as happening in space time before we consciously are aware that we're making a decision. So, those studies don't suggest that there's an outside force controlling us, but that we are governed by a part of our brain that that we're not conscious of, subconscious. Um, Milton begins book 3 with a prologue to light. Not going to spend a lot of time on this, but remember he was blind, and in his praising of light and in his invoking of light to give him guidance, he's using light as synecdoche for God, or metonymy, if you will. That light, illumination, goodness, or a biblical allusion, let there be light, is a reference to God. Here's just that initial 55 lines with some annotations that I'm going to move through pretty quick. Lines 19 and 20 talks about the dark descent, referencing his blindness, but at the same time, kind of echoing or a tip of the hat to uh, or an allusion to both Virgil's epic and Dante's epic, in which the hero went to the underworld. Lines 33 through 36, Milton compares himself with other blind poets, and particularly Maimonides. I probably butchered that. That's just another name for Homer. So this is Milton building up his credibility for matching the narrative prowess of Homer. And we get to the end of that where he has a renewed invocation. Lines 56 through 79 um, begins the conversation between God and, quote, his only begotten Son. So, Milton starts this off, and let's see, where are we? Yeah, in say line, skip down to the radiant image of his glory sat his only son on earth first beheld. It's interesting to compare and contrast the image of this scene with Satan sitting upon his throne back in book 2. Here, I just want to draw your attention to um, the bottom two lines. Uh, Milton is committed to describing God as knowing past, present, and future. In other words, omniscient. And he finally begins to speak. First about Satan, and then free will and responsibility. So we can see at the top, seest thou what rage transports our adversity? So Milton is capturing this picture of the two of them sitting and being able to see, literally or somehow metaphysically, what Satan is doing, having left the gates of hell, but not yet at earth. Milton is committed to portraying a God that is both omniscient and omnipotent. And I'll ask you to consider this question. Are there any sections that might call this characterization into question? God and the Son watch Satan leave through the gates of hell. Does God consider intervening? What are the implications of that? If he doesn't intervene here, but some people continue to believe that God does intervene, when would he and when wouldn't he becomes a tricky thing. Uh, in the bottom, line 90, God says, man was placed there on earth with purpose to assay him by force. So this is saying that man was put on heaven so man will be tested by Satan. In other words, that's his purpose, to be tested. It characterizes God as being in competition with Satan, which many people suggest would um, undermine the nobility of the God figure. In the red there in line 95, God says, so will fall he and his faithless progeny. Whose fault? Whose but his own? So God says the man will fall, implying it hasn't happened yet, and then rhetorically asked whose fault. So we have to wonder, how do readers read the tone of this? Whose fault? Whose but his own? That coming from an omnipotent and omniscient being um, makes it seem uh, to some readers as though he is um, a bit of a. The words are failing me right now, but obnoxious. Moving on, say line 102, Milton's talking about freely they stood who stood. He's talking about the angels that did not get persuaded by um, Satan. And of course, this is foreshadowing Abdiel, who is an important figure, the only absolutely original character in the whole epic. And some say Abdiel is Milton's ideal. And then there was in the bottom, when will and reason also is choice, useless vein of freedom, both despoiled. This raises the question for me anyway. God says man acted with his own reason. But really, is it possible to reason without knowledge of good and evil? And Adam, at this point, who is using his reason, God says he can. How can he reason if he doesn't have knowledge of good and evil already? Moving into this section, it raises the question of, how can predestination and free will coexist? Those last two lines. If I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault. Okay. God comes off as fairly defensive in these remarks. But he does make a tribute to free will, saying what an incredible gift it is in these lines. And beginning on line 129 there, talking about the demon's fall or the angel's fall, he's separating Adam and Eve's fall from the demons, saying he'll forgive, or potentially mercy could come upon Adam and Eve, but it wouldn't come on the others because they fell by themselves, he says. We get the son, perhaps the hero of this epic, speaking for the first time, and when he does, God, the son, in his opening speech, asks God three questions, which, if the Son and God are one substance, can they possibly share a consciousness? Well, because Milton's trying to tell a story, he has to separate them and have some know things that others don't. So it's just it's not very fulfilling from a theological standpoint of what Milton is attempting to uphold. So the first question, should man finally be lost? Should man, thy creature late so loved, the youngest son, fall? Will he fall? God, the son doesn't appear to know, even though God has just said he would. The second and third questions are talking about Satan, and will Satan get revenge um, by corrupting mankind? And lastly, wilt thou thyself abolish the creation and make for him what for thy glory thou hast made? Saying, again, the son doesn't know God's plans. God's response is interesting. I have in this slide highlighted all of the first person pronouns because the effect of reading all of those, me and my and I, seems to suggest a being, God, that is very filled with himself. And that is not an image of God that can be very persuasive or illuminating or inspiring, I suppose, to many. Um, just finishing up this little part, uh, he's conscious. That's the personified, the umpire. God asks, or God states in line 209, Adam, with his whole posterity, must die. Die he, or justice must. In other words, justice must be met. There cannot be justice if Adam is allowed to get away with this. Now, what about his whole posterity? All the unborn children and grandchildren, generation after generation, are they guilty? Well, according to God, they have to die for what Adam did. And then, perhaps most puzzling or tricky, God ends this speech asking a question. Where shall we find such love? Which of ye will be mortal to redeem man's mortal crime, and just the unjust to save, dwells in all heaven charity so dear. In other words, where will we find a being that is willing to become human and experience death? Now, if God, but the son does respond, and the son says, "Let death wreck all his rage," and those last lines, are a description of, the paradox of Christian faith, that through death one can get eternal life. And in this case, the son is saying that he will suffer what death delivers, and yet at the same time, he knows that he won't die, which I suppose in Milton's characterization could be seen as diminishing the actual bravery of the volunteerism. So I want to kind of finish this up because I know I've been going on for long. It's late. Here's the little thought food. Um, get a job, go to work, get married, have children, follow fashion, watch TV, act normal, walk on the pavement, obey the law, save for old age, repeat after me, I am free. Oh man, makes me feel like a robot. And lastly, here is not the link, but this is the website for a fascinating brief article on consciousness and free will and being aware of our decisions only after our brain has already made them for us. Anyway, have a great night. See you tomorrow.